So, some questions to get started with. Think back to the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve in the garden. How would you describe Adam and Eve in the garden? What was the situation like? Perfect. Okay, that's a very good definition. Why perfect? Okay, they had God, they had the garden, they had each other, they were full of joy. Anybody else? With God, they had everything, right? That's a good way to summarize it. Yep. Yeah, the study there is definitely a lot to. There you go. I'm not sure what happened there. Yeah, it's a lot to absorb the story of Adam and Eve and what happened to them. Yeah. At first, there was no sin. Interesting, right? They walked with God. Okay. Another day in paradise. That's a good description of what it was like. So, as time went on, Eve was tempted. She sinned. She ate of the fruit. Adam did as well. How did the situation change in the garden? There was sin. What did that mean? Separation. Okay. Death. Okay. Right. They weren't innocent anymore. They had this innocence before. God was taking care of all their needs, and that changed. They no longer had innocence. They had sinned, and they had separated themselves from God. So what changed in their life? How did their lives change? They were cast out of the garden. She had pain in childbirth. Okay. The knowledge of good and evil. Right. They had different knowledge, different mindset now. They knew what evil was. They had to work hard for their needs. Interesting. So, which was better, their situation before or their situation after? Before, obviously, right? So, the sin that occurred changed their relationship with God and changed the situation. So, I want us to remember that point. Now, let's think on what about us today? What's our relationship with God like? Okay. World over, the total is not good, but it's not God's fault. Okay. Why not? It's man's fault. Why is it man's fault? Disobedience, sin. If you don't feel as close to God, guess who moved? Yeah, it's a very good saying. Um, so it differs for each of us, right, in our relationship with God and how we perceive God and how we treat God and how we honor God. What's the situation of this earth that we live on today? Is it what God intended it to be from the beginning? Sorry? There'll be an end to it someday. What else? Right. Yeah. Yeah, so we're exactly where God intended it to be. This is God's plan all along. He knew what was going to happen, right? But it didn't have to be this way, did it? How would the world today be different if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned in the garden? That's a thing that you kind of want to wrap your mind around, but yet it also is somewhat impossible to wrap your mind around. How would the world be different? That's very good. Very, very good point. Our relationship with Christ definitely changes that and makes it even better than what Adam and Eve could have had. So that would have been lost for one thing. Yeah, very good point. So if we think about the situation and how things changed in sin, why do bad things happen in the world today? Let's just throw that question out there. That's kind of the whole topic of this whole book, right? Why do bad things happen in the world today? Because people are not following God? Okay, what else? Sorry? To give us hope? Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of selfishness. People have the Pharaoh mentality where I just want to be, I'm in charge of myself and I don't want to have to deal with God, right? I don't want to have to listen to that. Yeah. Mm, yeah. So God's intent for us was to be upright, right? It's to be perfect. But we fall short of that. And that gets back to what we talked about with Christ, right? Um, define bad things. Well, what I want you to think about is the same way that the world would think about it, right? When they say bad things, they mean a war happens, people starve, a hurricane destroys something, right? Those bad things that happen. Why does God let that happen? Some of it's because of chance. Okay. Yeah, there's. I want us now to think about the book of Job and what we know in the book of Job. There's a tendency for many people to try to connect it, this notion that because there's sin, right, and sin has entered into the world, that we can't have that perfect relationship with God anymore, except, of course, through Christ, as we've been talking about. But it has changed things, it's changed the situation. And it's that sin that causes bad things. And the natural conclusion for that is, well, then if I sin, bad things should happen to me, right? Isn't that the logical conclusion? And if I do good things, then good things should happen to me, right? That's a lot of what Job is trying to dispel. It's trying to crush that whole idea in our minds. Because that's, even if we look at Job's friends, we're going to go through this as we go through the book, but his friends we can kind of criticize for their attitude and the way they feel and the way they talk to Job. But many of us, in the back of our mind, are we still thinking that same thing? When we see someone that's new in Christ that comes and joins the congregation and maybe they've led a life of sin and they've had, bad problems occur, and then we see all the trouble and turmoil their life is it necessary that we think at the back of our minds, well, I'm glad I wasn't like that person. I'm glad I didn't do those things such that my life is better, right? And sometimes it's because of sin. Sometimes it's because of the consequences of sin. But sometimes it's just bad things that happen as chance, as we've talked about. The hurricane that comes over and wipes our house out, it may have nothing to do with the sin that we may have committed. Yeah. So Cain and his example, that's an interesting point, yeah. So we're not going to solve that question here today, obviously. We're not going to solve the entire book of Job today. But those are some things, some thoughts I want to put in your mind because it's only natural for the world to think that way, to think that, I won't say natural, it's comforting to the world to think that way, right? If I'm a good person and I do good things, then God will bless me and my life will be wonderful. And if I do bad things and hurt people, then my life will be destroyed and bad things will come upon me. But that's not what the book of Job is teaching us. And it's really important to wrap our minds around that. Because otherwise, when those bad things do happen to us, it can crush us. It can crush us quite easily. So we're going to talk about the book of Job. Obviously, the purpose of today's lesson is just to kind of give a little bit of an outline, a little bit of an overview. I'm hoping we can get into chapter 1 and do a little bit from chapter 1 today. But I want you to think on these things as we talk about Job. And as I said, if we get some slides up, it might help us stay a little bit more together on the topic. But for an outline I have, you'll notice that there's several interesting things about Job. In the beginning, Job chapter 1 and 2 is kind of a narrative that kind of sets the stage for what's going to happen. So, who can kind of summarize Job for me? Who wants to throw out there? What do we know about the book of Job, and what's it about? Somebody want to just put together like a 20,000-foot overview. What happens in Job? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. It ends up getting better for him. Okay, so that's a good summary that most people might give. Job is a good man. He's a righteous man before God. Satan comes to God, and God says, "Hey, look at Job. Have you considered who Job is?" And Satan basically tries to tempt him and say that, well, that's just because you're so good to Job. So God allows Satan to take away his property, to take away his family, eventually to take away his health. And through all this, Job kind of endures. And in the end, you see Job gets everything back, and he's been restored, and he has more than he started with. So, huh? Never lost his faith. Okay. So it's interesting. So all the stuff we just talked about is kind of the normal Job summary, right? That's chapters 1, chapter 2, and chapter 42. What about all that stuff in the middle? Mm, okay. So get some meaning from Job's name there. To have patience like Job. Yeah. Okay. So what about these chapters in the middle? Okay. God reprimanded him. That's another very important point in the book of Job towards the end. Yep. Okay. So the key thing is God is picking a fight with Satan, and because of that, Job suffers. It's an interesting way to look at it. Sorry, over here. Mm. Mm. So Satan asking permission kind of lends itself to that theory that God brings these bad things on people. Angie. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's the need there to be tightly holding on to God, and as you said, from was the First Peter about Satan being that roaring lion that's roaming about the earth, seeking whom he's going to devour. He's not looking for, as you said, he's not looking for the people that are already his. He's looking for us Christians, right, to pull us down, to drag us down, and that's that's why we're going to study the book of Job, right, Josh? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the natural thought that bad things wouldn't happen to good people, we see that time and time again is not true. And it's how we handle those situations that's important because that will affect our relationship with God and how strongly we can cling to God. Can you think of some good examples of bad things happening to good people from the Bible? Joseph? Yeah. David's baby and Bathsheba? Yeah. Um, Jesus is the perfect example of bad things happening to good people. Did Jesus deserve the bad things that happened to him? No. And yet they still happened to him. Why did they happen to him? Because that was God's plan, right? That was to fulfill God's purpose. That's what God set out to have happen. And God's purpose was fulfilled. So the purpose, again, for us to study Job is to have that mindset that's closer to what Jesus had, to see the bad things that are going on in our lives and the struggles and the bad things that are happening, and to be more like Jesus, to be able to withstand and endure those things, to be more like Job and not to give in and not to fail and to let those things bring us down. Because we're going to find out that bad things are going to happen to us in this world, and that's just life. Um, so some of my notes here, I'm just going to kind of go through. The book of Job is, I think, somewhat neglected in that context. We talked about chapters 1, 2, and 42, but all this meat in the middle is really going to help us, I think, to understand God's ways and why bad things happen and what our attitude towards them should be. Um, that's why there's these 38 chapters in the middle of this book, because they are important. And when we skip them, we're shortchanging, I think, what Job is trying to teach us. Um, it's not just about Job losing everything and getting it all back in the end, but there's a message in here for us. Uh, yep. Mm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's very important, and we're gonna hit on that as we get into the first few verses of this chapter, of chapter 1. That Job is doing it because he's a good person. It's not because he wants God to treat him well. It's not because he's looking to gain something from God. It's because he knows it's the right thing to do, and he wants to serve God. Yes, sir. What do you suppose is the source of Job's faith? We're never told anything about that. So why do you think Job was the source of Job's faith? Well, I'll ask everybody else. I don't have to answer. Sorry? Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the whole reason we learn about Job is because God is using this as a good example, right? Look at this man that is doing such good things, and he's doing that because of his love for God, and through his temptation and all the things that he endures, he's such a perfect example for us. And the way he reacts to it and his attitude, and then even as Daryl mentioned, that God has to rebuke him in the end. Like there's important lesson in there for us. And we're not, like I said, we're not gonna be able to cover it all today. But as we go through the book of Job, this is going to be really important to listen to. What kind of book is Job? How is it written? This is another important thing to understand about Job. Poetry, right? Yeah, it's interesting because the first two chapters we talked about are kind of this introduction, this narrative telling you what has happened and what happened to Job. Then it kind of switches to poetry. And then the rest of the book, all the way up to the last chapter, part of the last chapter, is all Hebrew poetry. So it's different. And I think when we come to it, like that's the trouble I have with it, I know personally, is thinking about it as a narrative and wanting to read it as a narrative, and it doesn't lend itself to that. It's in the section of the Old Testament with the books of wisdom, right? There's Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Those are all together there, right? So that's something for us to think about when we read Job and try to understand Job, is that we should have more the mindset that we're reading Psalms, right? When we see all these different parables and different things, that this prose is written in such a way, this poetry is written in such a way to help us to understand, and we need to kind of take it in that kind of context. It's not a history book is the important thing. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So Job loses everything, and literally everything, right? And he's asking why, and that's an obvious question that he would have, right? I mean, if we were in his shoes, how would we react if everything was taken away from us? We would naturally want to know why. And his dealing with that and struggling with that and trying to understand what that means is an important part of the book of Job. Okay, so let's kind of get into the meat of Job a little more. Does anybody have any other comments about the book kind of overall as an overview that you want to bring up now? Feel free to. I do appreciate the comments. It definitely helped me stay organized here. I do have an outline, I guess, and I'll mention that one of the things you'll see in Job is, again, the first two chapters being this kind of narrative, then it switches to this poetry kind of form. Job talks about his despair and his situation, and then you'll see this kind of repeated exchange, right? You'll see someone speaking to him or making accusations against him, and then Job's reply to those accusations. So you'll see, like Eliphaz, one of his friends, will say something to him, and then he will reply. And then Bildad will speak to him in like a speech, a poem kind of thing, and then he'll reply. And then Zophar speaks, and then he replies. And you keep going through the book as these different cycles of speeches come back and forth. And in the very end, you see God comes into the picture and speaks to him, right? God speaks directly to Job and to his friends, and then Job has a response to make to that. And then at the very end, we switch back to the narrative, and we learn kind of that Job's life has been rebuilt and that he's been restored to what he had before. So that's kind of a rough outline. I've got it broken up into like 16 different sections, so I'm not sure if we're going to do one lesson per section. I'm going to try to stick to that as best I can, hopefully put a couple of them together, but I'm not sure if we'll be able to do that, but it'll just kind of depend on how we go through the book and how many comments people have, which is always great. I always appreciate the comments. So to start today, I just want to get through the first part of Job, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And if I could get somebody to read just that first section, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and that'll be our main focus for the remainder of today. Thank you. Excellent. So the first question I want to tackle, I want you to think about, and this is something that comes up sometimes and people want to ask about, is Job a real person? Did these events really happen? Yes. Okay, how do you know that? Because it's there in the Bible. Anybody else? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's referred to in the New Testament. It certainly appears that it's a real person. There's so much detail given that it's very specific to Job. And if you learn about his life and his family and stuff that you wouldn't necessarily need to have if it's just a made up character, right? And then at the end of the book of Job, you'll also learn more about Job and his situation, and those things are also very detailed, very specific. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. So yeah, there's certainly some history being passed down here, and it definitely presenting Job in a light that's meant to be a lesson for us, right? That is meant to help us to understand and exactly answer that question: why do bad things happen to good people? It's this question that people have struggled with, the Jews struggled with, we struggle with today. It's the question that really can really be dragging on us if we don't have a good answer to, a good understanding of. So yeah, I tend to think that Job is a real person, and the story is describing him. There probably are some details that may have changed over time, but I think the content, the intent of the story is there to present to us this lesson that we've just been talking about. Um, so the book opens with this man who is in the land of Uz. Is there any significance to the land of Uz? Where Abraham was from? Why Uz? Why not somewhere else? Who was Uz? If you remember the story of Noah, he's one of the descendants. Aram, son of Shem, one of the sons of Aram, son of Shem, a great grandson of Noah. So there's a region perhaps named after him. I don't know, Zach, if you know more about it than I do, but that's what I found in my looking it up. Um, do you think it's important that this is set in the land of Uz and not like Jerusalem or some other place? Is there any significance? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, so it kind of helps us with the setting a little bit, the time frame. Yeah, exactly. And I think one important point though is that it's not connected with Israel. So it's not just a message for the Jews. It's not just a message for Israel. It's a message that's meant to be more broad than that. And that's one thing I take, I think, from this kind of setting is that it's not happening in Israel. It's not a message just to Israel, but it's kind of more universal. It's for all people, for all time, to handle this problem that we've been talking about this why suffering occurs and why bad things happen. I think it's not just something for Jews to pay attention to, it's something for all of us to pay attention to. There's nothing here that says it only applies to Israel or the laws governed under the law of Moses. And sometimes when we read something, we'll say, well, this is important because the laws that the Jews followed at the time said not to do this or to do that, and that's why they reacted the way they did. But in this case, it's more generic than that, more general than that. Any other thoughts on that? Bob? Mm-hmm. I think this Shem is later on after Noah. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Yeah. There definitely were good people in that era, that time frame. Job being a good example, obviously, as what we just talked about. He had that kind of character. He had faith for whatever reason that he trusted and believed in God, and that was a credit to him. How would you describe Job's character? And we've touched on this a little bit before, but how do you describe Job's character? God fearing, pretty honest and upright. Verse 1, that man was perfect and upright and one that feared God and eschewed evil. So it's a pretty high regard there for him, pretty high commendation for him there. The text wants us to see that he's a righteous person, that he's blameless, that he's upright before God. He's one that fears God and turns away from evil. He's wholeheartedly trying to please God. He has integrity. He's not false. He's not a hypocrite. He's not doing one thing and saying another. That's an important thing. Not only was Job personally upright, how did he react to the other people around him, to his family? What did he do for them? That's from verse 5, right? Yeah, yeah. He was sacrificing for his sons in case they had sinned and cursed God in their hearts. He did that continually. So, what do you take from that verse? He's worried about his kids. He's trying to make amends even for their sins, right? He's trying to make them pleasing to God. Yeah, that's another important point. The greatest of all men of the East. He was very important. He was very well looked at by people, right? Uh, mhm. Yeah, so I mean, that's a very good question to make, right? Is he well respected and viewed as a great man because he was rich, right? That certainly could be true to some extent. But if you think about rich people today, we see a lot of rich people today, and we may have respect for them or think they're important, but we don't necessarily say hey, that guy's great, or he's the greatest of all people. I mean, maybe in the worldly view, you would want to think that, but even in that case, people tend to have bad things to say about people that are just rich. So I think there was something more to it. I think people saw how Job acted, and I think we'll learn that as we go on in some of his discussions that he has with his friends there, that he was trying to be upright. He was trying to do what was right, and he was really trying to be pleasing to God. And because of that, the things that he did, a lot of people had good respect for him. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we'll learn as we go on that there's this when he talks about the respect that he had and the way that people viewed him and how that changed after he was afflicted, that people would spit on him and do bad things to him, and how his situation had changed. But it was clearly, for the most part, people at this point highly respected Job and thought good things about him. Um, so one of the important points that I want to take from this is, what Jimmy brought up earlier, is that Job was doing this because he loved God. He was doing this because he wanted to be pleasing to God. He wasn't doing this because he was looking forward to all those great things God was going to give him. He wasn't doing it because, like, well, if I make these sacrifices for my children, God will give me some more money or make my life easier or something like that. It just seemed that he was just concerned about his children and the way they were acting, and he was going to try to do whatever he could to improve the situation for them. And he cared for them. And he cared for those that were around him. He was a righteous person. The point here is not trying to analyze the righteousness of Job to explain all he was doing. The point of the text is to emphasize that all that is about to happen to him is not because of his personal sins. There is nothing more that we should do with what is recorded about the righteousness of Job. Sin is not the reason for the suffering of Job. Or to state this point more accurately, Job is not the one on trial. Job is a man of complete integrity. And that's a key foundation, I think, for the book here. So, very important point to dwell on is it's not saying that Job's really good, but he's going to fail if he gets tempted a little bit, so we're going to put him on trial. It's that he's a man of complete integrity, and he's someone that's righteous, and he's someone that is pleasing to God. And it's not because of any sin that he's committed that God is now going to allow these sufferings to happen to him. That the suffering that's going to happen to him is because of Satan's doing, and it's not because Job was a sinner. Yeah. 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 And that's a very good point. Yeah, his attitude about righteousness is important there. He was someone that loved righteousness, and that affected the way he acted, and affected the way he acted with people. Same thing's true for us today, right? It's where our heart is. That's the kind of fruit that we bear. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Absolutely. That's a perfect summary, and that's why we have Job, is because it helps us with that understanding. And it would be really hard to have, I think, if we didn't have Job. In the last couple of minutes we have left, I just want to look at the rest of this section here that we read, verses 2 through 3. What else do we know about Job? How is he described in verses 2 and 3? He's rich. It tells us about all he had. What did he have? Lots of children. Yeah. The numbers here are interesting that are used, right? You see the numbers that are mentioned in the passage. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. 7 being this kind of good number, right? And then the 3 daughters, 7 plus 3, he had 10 children. That's a sign of completeness, right? It's an interesting connection that's being made there. That basically what it's saying is Job's family was perfect. He had the ideal family that he would have. 7 sons, 3 daughters. He was well set that he had these heirs that were going to be there after he was gone. He has 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys. He was a rich man. He had many, many possessions, and he was very well blessed by God, right? The other interesting point is the text doesn't say that he had 10 children, but that there were born to him 10 children. So, like, these were blessings of God that God had granted him. They were not just people that he had gotten or children that he had acquired. These were his children that were born to him. And back to this notion of an ideal family.